Empower your leadership journey with the CEO Series. Whether you're at the gym, strolling, or commuting, our impactful dialogues with world-class leaders are just a click away. Immerse yourself in the minds of visionaries shaping today's most influential companies and innovations. It's not just an interview. It's a masterclass in leadership. Don't miss out. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and major streaming platforms.
Good morning, good evening, depending upon what part of the world you're in. If it's Friday, it is the CEO Series, where we bring together the most inspiring leaders, entrepreneurs, global thinkers from across the globe. And our guest today is a dear friend, Severin Wilson, who's a globally recognized corporate communication strategist, deep roots in law, journalism, diplomacy, AI. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies, led communication for Web3 and AI firms, has served on a democracy building mission for the Carter Center, fluent in 5 languages, and a citizen of 4 countries. He brings a unique multicultural lens to every leadership conversation. And with that, I say, how are you, man?
I'm doing well, Ron. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you.
You've uplifted me.
Well, I was only telling the truth. So, I mean, it wasn't like I embellished it.
Like in an uplifting way you did, yes.
I see. Okay, thank you so much. But anyway, so normally we start our show asking our guests to walk us through that unique path from law, journalism, diplomacy, AI, corporate communications. 5 languages too. Also.
That path. Well, as far as the languages are concerned, I can only take credit. Can't take much credit there. My parents instilled their languages into me, and I was just born in an environment, where those languages were omnipresent. At any time you had to speak them. Okay. So that's that. Yeah. As far as my professional journey goes, for these different stages that disciplines that you mentioned, I have been from inception, I would say, an extremely curious person. And if there's something that itches me is when I can't understand something, but it interests me. And that has, been very much the driver behind me, taking up these learning challenges, 1. Number 2, I think that there is no such thing as a pure discipline that is not dependent upon other disciplines. Okay. In the sense that, if you are in business, law is going to intrude all of the time, as will be the ability to handle the media, the press, etc., ergo journalism. So for me, academic pursuit was not so much done for the sake of it, but really to understand, these various components of business. And yeah, that's the reason behind that journey that you just mentioned there. Endless curiosity and urge to understand.
Was there any defining moment as you were going through those transitions? I say transitions that you're going through. Was there any if you look back on your journey, was there a defining moment this was kind of the anchor that moved me towards something else? Or?
Well, I remember a time when I was working in Almaty in Kazakhstan, and I had a change project, and it was really to optimize the workforce in terms of its output. It was a law/accounting firm. And, Kazakhstan, like so many post-Soviet countries, still have very much in their fabric this command type of attitude to management. People, you micromanage, plus people are not asked to take the initiative, they're asked to follow instructions. And I found that in that particular ambient in which I was working, and I have just freshly graduated from my MBA in Chicago, I felt, well, wow, this is contrary. Everything that I've seen and learned in terms of self-empowerment and taking the initiative. And you asked me, what was one major change point there in my life, was seeing that. And I undertook myself to tell my team, listen, we're going to play a little game. We're going to play this game that you are in power and that you know what you are doing and that you don't have to ask for every small thing to get approval for it. I really approached the whole challenge from a gamification point of view, because on heavy would have not worked. So I created a game. We called it I Can, the I Can game. And it was basically you had to have at least 2 icons a day, and they would be tallied up at the end. And the person who had done most of them, would get a prize. The whole idea behind it was really to moving from this absolutely entrenched mindset that you had to ask permission for every small thing, because there's lots of cultural things, fear of failure, excessive deference towards authority, all of these things, yes, up there, that stifle self-expression, and with it, the ability to explore what we can actually do versus what, others say we can do,
That kind of resonated with me when I was doing this, because I left New York City to move to Saudi Arabia, and it was the same kind of culture mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think, sir? I said, no. I asked you, what do you think? And so that culture, how do you flip that from always going to the boss has to approve everything, to you thinking on your own? Because I've always kind of connected back to there's a graphic that's called the iceberg of ignorance. And when you look at that graphic, you see that the people on the bottom, they know everything. They know everything, the problems, they can identify them. But we stifle that as we move up top, because they're looking up here for all the solutions in doing that.
Yes. And attitudes changed. I changed attitudes, in the 8 months of this project, and was very, very interesting, because I still am in contact with many of those people, who tell me how much really, my leadership style impacted them in terms of, self-empowerment and critical thinking abilities. So that for me was a very significant inflection point in my career. Realizing the challenge that does exist, and B, more importantly for me, that I'm actually quite effective in these types of situations. So where do we go there with that? Yeah.
So, you said you're still in touch with those people. That was another learning point for me, because when I would interview people to work, I would always ask, how many people from your last job are you still connected with?
Yes, very interesting indicator.
Yeah. And, when they say, oh, well, we kind of moved away. So go back to the last job. And if you kept coming up blank on that one, I knew I wanted people that could build bridges, the people that would enjoy working, that they could always anchor back to that learning experience with that leader, in doing that. So that's remarkable that those people are sharing their successes based on your grounding.
Yeah. And that, again, from a professional point of view, needless to state, is absolutely fulfilling. If you were to ask me, well, what makes me happy at situations like that, folks actually remembering coming back from time to time and saying, I just experienced this today and I had to think of you,
Did you patent that and move it forward in the
I haven't. I wish it upon everyone, actually.
Okay. Because that, that's I think a lot of, when you look at leadership competencies, empathy is the biggie now, because that competency is a new way to, I don't want to say lead people, but to work with people. And empathy is understanding cultural differentiations, and trying to empower people to grow on their own.
Yes. Yeah. And when we say this, empowering people to grow on their own, when we come from Western society, and we've done the MBA stuff, we're all familiar with all of these concepts from an early stage on. It is easy to take for granted the notion of self-empowerment, because that's what everybody is taught in the West, right?
Yes.
How can you be the best? You aspire to be more. How do I find my inner this, and that? It's not that way everywhere in lots of parts of the world. It's not that way in post-Soviet societies, where those notions simply have not been present in the cultural fabric. So how do you then, as a Western company moving into these territories, you want to have, your culture spread overseas? How do you instill this type of thinking, this individualistic self-empowerment thinking, in context where people from the time that they were born were told that you take instructions and you're as good as you are in fulfilling instructions? Those are worlds clashing there,
That cultural differentiation. I remember in a meeting, a gentleman, someone told me in the meeting, said, "Ron, you always keep referencing U.S. New York. We're in Saudi Arabia now. It's totally different." And I thought about that driving on the way home. I said, you know what? He's right. I said, let me move away from that, because that was a learning curve for me, because I was coming in and figured I was just going to come in and wave the wand and everything was going to change, and it did not happen.
Yeah.
As a result of that. And so I think we both learned from each other. And when you think about the people that you've empowered and they're out doing their thing, they probably use that model to say, I can.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is why I said maybe you should have patented and built a course around it that you can.
Good thinking.
Yeah. So when you think of, you mentioned your parents, you mentioned languages, you mentioned people are still calling you. Who are you calling? Who are your mentors in your journey?
Okay, mentors. Well, I would say it was my boss at the Carter Center. My former boss at the Carter Center had a huge impact on me.
Okay, that's President Carter's Center for people that are not familiar with the Carter Center.
Yeah. So, there was a particular incident. We were with President Carter at the University of Guyana, and I was a junior program assistant. But I had worked on this particular project, which we were going to present on at the University of Guyana to the students, and President Carter had been invited. And, normally the seating orders are such that here is the big man, President Carter, in the middle, and he's flanked by his most senior people. My boss, before we got on the stage, tapped me and said, "You sit next to him." I said, "What?" So, yeah, you sit next to President Carter. And that's a moment which, in my life, in terms of mentorship and inspiration, captured so much. The sense of humility and knowing when to give another person a chance and pushing other people. First of all, it informed my spiritual journey in as much as awareness is concerned. So much. Because to be really aware, you have to put away so many other norms, as this gentleman did, my boss did at that moment. He put aside the traditionalist approach of the most senior person next to the boss. He took the young aspiring kid and put him next to him. And I mean, there's a picture of me. I mean, I'm all proud. I mean, you can see the pride flowing from me, but it's been such an instrumental moment in my life, because from a management point of view, whenever I get the opportunity, and I really mean this sincerely, whenever I get the opportunity to put someone in front of me, I take advantage of it, of my young employees. That was very much also my driving force at Career Builder. When I was managing director at Career Builder, every opportunity that presented itself where I could plug somebody and say, boom,
you go.
Hey,
you said there.
You got it, right? Because there's a lot of truth that rings in my ear, also to this adage that you're only as good as your ability to replace yourself. Now, you're really good if you're not needed anymore. It's a paradox thing. But if you do a really great job as a manager, less reliant people will become on you, because you are giving them the ability to do what you've been doing. And coming back to that particular moment you asked me, that moment was a huge empowerment moment, which showed to me that I can do it. Yeah. And once I was able to do it, I was gone. I was flying.
That was the beginning stages of I can.
Yes, of I can indeed.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. So when you think of that and that lesson you learned at such a young age, do you think that was kind of the fire that says, I'm going to start doing kind of the same thing, and this is my learning moment that's going to anchor me in life as it relates to managing people or relationships or whatever?
I didn't really think about it on a very conscious way. It's something that happened on a subconscious level. I didn't have yet the very specific context in which I was going to build this into, but I knew that moment that something in me had changed, and that something had been enriched in me, and that I have been given a sort of responsibility to emulate that which was just given to me.
I always use photos, and my son was telling me one time, and I was at his house, and he had this photo. I said, "What is this?" He said, "This is what I aspired to do, whatever it was." And I said, "That's pretty cool." He said, well, you always did the same thing. He said, you'd always put a photo of the thing you wanted next or whatever it was. And I said, I didn't know the learning that came from that, and trying to do that. So I asked you that. Did you capture that? Did you capture that moment with a photo of that you?
Yes, there's a photo of that.
There's a grounding, So when I work here, I have a grounding. I have my parents. I have my grandmother. It's all family photos of my kids, wife. Everything is here, and it kind of keeps me grounded.
Mm-hmm.
To do better or whatever, as if I have an audience of all these people watching me.
Yeah, I mean, I have that particular moment, which has really profoundly influenced me, engraved upon my conscience. I have a big photo here and here, the heart and the head. Yeah.
So with all the transitions you made, all cool, was there a moment or setback that you had to kind of take a step back and said, oh, wasn't prepared for this one? How do I move to get back on track or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very big one at the at Career Builder. So I served as managing director of Career Builder in Germany, and I started the operation from scratch. There was no infrastructure, there was absolutely nothing, no employees, nothing. I mean, it was as startup can be. And through the process of hiring, every individual was not just a hire; they were really part of building this company from scratch. And therefore, the relationship to the people that I had was very, very close. It was much more like a family endeavor. And one of the things that was guiding me in Germany was that I very quickly saw, and this is a funny story, not funny, it's actually quite serious, that the best, most hungry, talented people turned out not to be Germans. That turned out to be North Koreans, Albanians, Turks, etc., people who had hunger, who would normally be excluded from other opportunities, or definitely not get the type of opportunity that I gave them.
I know.
And I ended up with a workforce that was, I mean, from my sales workforce, almost, I would say 60-70% non-German. And don't get me wrong, I'm not mentioning non-German. I don't mean this in a disparaging point of view. I just mean that from a cultural point of view, in terms of the people who had real hunger in their belly. I mean, if you're an immigrant and you come to Germany and you want to achieve, then you've got to be strong. Let me put it like this: you've got to be really, really, really strong. It's not an immigrant's paradise, not for the job place acceleration part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the lessons that I learned from that, because there was a moment when Career Builder decided that they were going to work with merge with other company, etc., 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 and my job was gone. But what was not gone was those really powerful relationships which I had built with these people. And in hindsight, I learned from that maybe I need to be a little bit more cautious in terms of the depth that I develop these relationships to. I have that, I mean, I could have not foreseen the 2-year time span, fair enough, but maybe, because I tended up giving myself to an extent which was just like, when I look in hindsight, ridiculous. I mean, I had a sofa in the office. I slept there sometimes. I mean, you can drive everything to an extreme.
I know. I was, you mentioned the sofa. There were times that when I was really in the zone, I would sometimes get up and go to the office on Sundays because it was quiet and I can do all the work I needed to do. And I didn't consider it work. I'd never really considered it work because I just enjoyed what I was doing. And I was so into that zone and trying to do that. I would not suggest that to people today.
No.
Keep the separation,
But at the same time,
go ahead.
But at the same time, it's just a beautiful feeling to have something that inspires you to the extent that you would be willing to do that.
Yeah.
Right. That's the beautiful part of it. The flip side of that is that in terms of reciprocity, you've got to be like really, really careful, that the equation stays healthy.
Equation stays healthy. I did some work in Singapore last week, and one of the questions I asked the group, I said, who knows what TGIF means? Everybody, yay, TGIF. I said, what about TGIM? They said, never.
Yeah.
Never. Would I enjoy coming in on Monday morning. And as they were giving me that, I always ask that, but as they were giving me that, I'm like, so they probably have never reached that zone that it's just, I really love it. And it's not really the separation of all of that. So it's kind of a conundrum. And then when you look at engagement surveys across the globe, they're down and people are not satisfied. They're doing what they're doing because they have to do it. How can we correct that? I'm going to ask you because I mean you worked in cultural situations across the globe. How can we? I don't want to say correct. How can we change the mindset of leaders? I'm going to say leaders because the culture will start there.
I think in a day-to-day, from a leader's point of view, recognizing that at the end of the day, and I mean this is such truism, we say it all of the time, but it begs reminding ourselves constantly that our company is our people. Mm-hmm. And if our people are not content, our company cannot prosper. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, everybody says, so what? We know that. Everybody knows that. Yeah, that's okay, good. Everybody knows that. But now comes the second step. How do you start tackling that from a practical point of view on a daily basis, especially, in a culturally dispersed context?
Yes.
What I have found to work best for me was to do as I say and say as I do. Simple leadership by example. If I say, for example, it makes a huge difference to have native language proficiency, and I accomplished A, B, and C because of that, then I inspire in the most direct way to get others to get their backsides up and learn the language, which I did manage to do.
Yeah.
So I think there is a directness driven by purposeful engagement, which is the answer to your question, that really shining by example. You have to shine by example in any given context, but in the cross-cultural context, even more so.
I do a lot of work with, I say, the big shots. And sometimes I'm really surprised at how, and I'm saying this in a nice way, they just don't get that. And this is in a global context because not that you can go back into the learnings that came up and you were talking about your parents were guiding and all these kinds of things. But I find it missing in a lot of people. And I find it more from an ageism perspective. I find younger leaders are more open to do things, and whereas the older leaders are still anchored in a different time zone. Have you come across, or you don't agree, whatever?
Well, I think the age differential, to be honest with you, I have not felt. I've actually, in fact, many instances where I had working with older folks being by far more open than the younger folks, just due to the exposure that they've had.
Okay.
Right. Now with this younger generations that we're working with right now, it is true. It is a little bit of a different game, I have to say. It is a little bit of a different game to talk about the notion, for example, about doing good by doing well, doing good things and that align with business objectives, and have this confluence of business and purposeful output and good output. Big eyes, saying, what do you mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Things have become a little bit more self-centric.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about leadership, your leadership style developed over global contexts, thrown in different situations, multiple law, journalism, diplomacy, AI. Were they key learning points if you were speaking to a group of aspiring leaders, CEOs, whatever it would be, that you could kind of give them an anchor as to how maybe they should explore curiosity or explaining the new dynamics of a workforce, explaining the cultural differentiations between in the global context? What would be some key thoughts or key themes?
Well, key theme for me, particularly in the German context, coming back to Germany, was really diversity. I constantly, from the work that I've done in Chicago on my MBA, I focus primarily on cultural diversification as a formula for success. Now, that's a very American notion, notwithstanding the times that we are living through right now, which is a bit of an anomaly. I hope it just stays an anomaly. But notwithstanding this present anomaly, America has always been representative of the notion that diversity is a real driver for business success. And I took that. Being indoctrinated with that thinking and joyfully also embracing it in my own life. I took this to my peers and talking to managers, fellow managers, and CEOs, and I would always come back to the point of what I had done in trying to duplicate that in Germany, that my team basically was successful because it was so diverse, because it allowed us to reach out to multiple constituencies who looked like my team looked, and that it was not, some sort of social experiment, but that it was something which, in fact, from an empirical point of view, proves itself right, especially if you've got global ambitions. I observe that a lot in the present context when I consult German companies. It's always there's this hunger to go internationally and must go, but the first thing that is done or thought of is sending somebody from the company to that country. And I think to myself, well, you want to have somebody from that country working side by side, with your guy from Germany, but you do want your guy from Germany to sort of have the understanding that he is the one who needs to act with an act of humility, because he's going to be indoctrinated and educated on what makes that particular country work. So, Ron, coming back to the question, in terms of what do I tell leaders, what do I tell CEOs, in this particular context, it is that.
That's a hard sell in the U.S. today.
It is a hard sell, but I hope it just stays that way temporarily.
Yeah.
4 years may seem an eternity, but they need not be.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. So you're now in business. You started and got your anchor in civic engagement, working with the Carter Center. You talked about how that shaped your views. Are there aspirations that one day we've gone through the business, we've done this, flip that back to the grounding of civic engagement? Or are you trying to think of matching those two together, business and civic connections?
It's both, a little bit of both. I grew up half of my life in the so-called third world, and surrounded by dire poverty, surrounded by extremely limited avenues for upward mobility. And that has profoundly shaped me in terms of everything that I do, in terms of what I don't take ever for granted. And when I am out there and I'm doing what I'm doing and I'm working with fellow managers or I'm working with team members, as something that very, very much guides me is that, oh my God, how fortunate.
Yeah.
How fortunate are we to be part of this? By that, I mean, the industrialized West, where we can work. How fortunate are we? Yeah. And I start with that in terms of also when I do my work on consulting companies on the international expansion. Depending where they're coming from and depending where they're going, it might be the most important thing for them to be aware how fortunate they are.
Okay. And drive it.
And let that radiate from them,
Upbringing has a lot as an anchor. I grew up in a small town, 6,000 people. And you're talking about growing up in poverty situations. My father was an entrepreneur and mother was a housewife. But those things anchor us, In a lot of cases, it could be for the good and it also could be for the bad, in driving that. So as you explore, and now you're transitioning into AI, how did that, you've gone through 3 different structures, law, journalism, diplomacy, and now we're moving into AI. What do you bring to the table to the AI perspective?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not in AI from a technical point of view, but from a non-technical point of view.
Yeah, high level.
So high level, also nitty-gritty stuff in terms of impact on workforce, things to keep in mind. The European Union is the most regulated market there is. I mean, AI, in terms of AI, the EU was the first body to come up with AI-specific legislation. There's a different degree of sensitivity towards all things AI in Europe. And there's a much greater, I think, need to educate the audience. In America, everybody, and there's somewhere in other places, are just jumping on the bandwagon because there's so much money flowing into it.
Yeah.
And so everybody wants to sort of associate themselves with that phenomenon. But there are lots of critical questions which remain unanswered, especially in the workforce context. To what extent is it ethical for AI to replace certain tasks that a person was doing before? Is it really optimum to do that? What are some of the, down the road repercussions of that in terms of, privacy and productivity? Are we really going to get to a point where we do not need certain categories of workers anymore? Can AI fully replace them? But what does that replacement of a worker mean now in terms of the company's product and outreach image, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We are all assuming at this moment that you say AI and it means automatically something positive, wonderful, great, which is going to totally transform the world the way it was before, and nothing is going to be the same. Well, again, if you've been around the block once or twice, you've heard this exuberance.
Yeah.
You've been around this type of exuberance before, around other things that came up. Now, I'm not trivializing artificial intelligence at all. It is shifting the ground upon which we stand, which, however, then requires also some very critical questions to be posed.
If you could go back to your younger self at whatever stage that would be, what advice would you give your younger self as they, you come out of university and you think the sky's the limit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you just keep going up, and you realize that nope, gotta go here, turn around, go back, start all over again. What advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, it's the same advice that I give my boys, my children. I very much instill the idea of be curious but be focused at the same time.
Okay.
Constantly stay focused on define your goal. I would say I would have accomplished maybe more if I had earlier defined my goals. I savored the knowledge for knowledge. I loved working in the different countries, etc. But what was the goal? What's the ultimate point where you want to be? And that's the most difficult thing actually to answer many times. So to answer your question directly, I would go back to my younger self, much younger self. Thanks God I figured it out eventually. But what is your goal?
Yeah. So we always hear the concept of do what you love, and a lot of people say, yeah, right. That's all well and good until life hits you, and do all these things. So going back to the younger self and trying to guide that, and the learnings that came about, as a result of that. Lots of times there's so much noise that's coming around, and how do we filter through that and to find that so-called sweet spot? Like I knew coming out of university that I knew I wanted to eventually end up going in business. I wanted to eventually end up, being the word wasn't around then, I don't think, an entrepreneur, because my family was in business and I wasn't afraid of it. I just had to figure something out. How do you test it? I mean, how do you?
If you're fortunate, you have role models around you who show you.
Okay.
Right? If you're fortunate. I was very fortunate in the sense that I had my father as a very strong role model, who had done his master's, who had done his PhD, etc. So that was very, very influential. I had clarity there. But lots of people don't have that type of, opportunity to have these clarity points. And what I would say there is that, it's a luxury to have that problem, right? Because that also implicit in not knowing where you want to go exactly is that you're somehow okay with where you are at the moment. Yeah. There's no fire burning. There's no urgency to it. And I would always counsel to do this, create the moment of urgency. We are creatures that act the most when something becomes urgent. Mm-hmm. Pull forward as much as you can that urgency moment.
Mm-hmm. I try and read as much as I possibly can, the curiosity on the new dynamics of a workforce. Average age is skewing younger. There's a so-called S curve. The majority of challenges you're going to have in trying to manage your workforce is probably going to come from the younger generation of workers who coming in with a totally different mindset versus the other groupings of that. But my disconnect sometimes, and what I struggle with when I'm talking to leaders to understand in an organization today, and this is Ron Thomas' version of that, you have two customers. You have the external customers, which is driving revenue, and the internal customer who is enabling you to drive the revenue. And they both are equal importance. So when you think back to the cultural differentiation, you talked about ICANN, empowering those people to move forward. And I think that's a struggle between the two customer concepts. Do you have any thoughts on that? That's just what I struggle with thinking about a lot, because we have to understand that the people are driving the revenue. If we do the ICANN throughout all functions, global workforce, whatever, it's going to connect to business results.
Well, sure enough, it will. Sure enough, it will. Yes.
But any thoughts on the dynamics of the, you said you built the team from scratch, younger people culturally and all those kinds of things. For organizations to realize, and my way of looking at it is a two customer concept, external customer driving revenue, but how do we keep moving and empowering those younger dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the younger groups, it's also become a whole lot more complicated in terms of, placating certain demands, because these generations are much more attuned to political issues. Where do you stand on the environment? Where do you stand on A, B, and C topic? That was necessarily not the case when we were coming up in our careers. ESG was something that, who knew about ESG? So that's something at the forefront of these younger generations in terms of their consideration of working for jobs. And you see companies making a very active effort that I did not see during my time. I mean, in the early days, in terms of appealing to the cultural aspects of where the workers were coming from. It used to be very much, you got a job, be thankful, you get a payment. That's it, period. You want to what? You want to learn about the environmental context my company's working in and what is its carbon footprint. And if we could do anything about that, excusez-moi.
Get out of here. We make money. That's what we do.
Exactly. Now we see a bit of a return to this bosseism idea in certain places, but fortunately not everywhere.
Yeah, I gave a speech in Pakistan a year ago, I think it was, and so mine was in the morning. I mean, mine was coming up late the next morning, and they had a panel of the CEOs at the end of the day, and they were all these big dreams and strategy, getting here and market share, and all these kinds of thought processes. And I said, I'm going to change my presentation tomorrow morning based on this, because I'm a people strategist person. I say workforce architect. And I changed my entire speech based on the two prongs: newer customer, and the older customer, which is drive revenue, external versus internal. And I kind of told them off in a nice way that I think some consideration. I said, of all the presentations I heard yesterday, they were all fantastic, but no one mentioned people. No one mentioned the workers. No one mentioned creating a fertile environment for people to grow and all those kinds of things. But you're expecting all of these lofty things, and the engine is the younger generation, the workers, and all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
I got a standing ovation from the people in the audience. The big shots, kind of set back, but a few of them came offline and said, we needed that clarity moment. So I try and use every opportunity that I can. This is why what scenario you were speaking to senior leaders, what message would you leave them? Because I think it's a learning curve for them, as you just talked about, ESG and all these kinds of things, that purpose-driven organization. Any thoughts?
Well, there's certain things which become very counterproductive if they're not authentic. And authenticity in these things is crucial. Are you driving these change initiatives as a response to something that you would prefer not to have to deal with, of which you have a negative feeling? Or are you doing this because you genuinely believe that this must be done? Exactly, versus chatter.
Yeah.
Because everything that is done in an inauthentic way is sooner or later going to reveal itself, and then you fall into, well, why did we do this? Just for retreat purposes, etc., etc. And it can only create misunderstandings. So, Ron, my answer to there is since sincerity is one key point, but also an absolute belief that whatever initiatives you're driving in that case, and be it propagating a company culture, that it is something that comes from a heart, which is conviction is the key word here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are you most excited about? I mean, you have your fingers in so many different pies. Globally, you've done it all. Done it all, as in quotes.
Right.
What are you most excited about for your future?
But right now I'm really super excited about following the entire evolution of AI in related matter and relates to management and people management in particular. So management overall and people management overall, because some of the decisions that are going to have to be made, and you look at some of those surveys, managers and companies have not really yet wrapped their head around what this means. I mean, beyond firing people, beyond lower headcount, but it means a whole lot more than that. Yeah. Because when your product, your service is going to be constituted in measurable part by a non-human element, because this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Then things will come with that, as far as the audience that you're trying to sell that product/service to. You are going to have to not only redefine the work you work, but also redefine maybe the way you brand certain things, explain certain things. Me coming on air on your show and saying, well, I'm a management consultant and I do A, B, and Z is one thing. I can explain to you where my human input is there. But if I were to come in and say, well, I am an AI implementation manager, then I would have a hard time telling you, ultimately what this product is going to be made of in terms of its human component. And what does that mean? So a lot of change coming there that I think has not been thought through thoroughly yet, but we're getting there. We're doing that because it's been working with such speed, the forces to be in terms of regulation, in terms of management, they're lagging behind, which is typical in a situation where technology booms like this.
Yeah, but when I look at the AI revolution, I think back to, I worked at Ford Motor Company years ago, and there were 3 shifts: 8 to 4, 8 to 4, 4 to 8, 4 to 12, 12 to 8, whatever it was. 3 shifts. That doesn't happen anymore. So that transition for workforce, for factories, it's robotics and all those things. I look at the AI revolution as kind of a hyped up version of that same industrial revolution that everything came up. Factories moved away, factories moved to Vietnam and all those places. But again, we have to build the workforce and we have to build leaders to navigate this.
Yes.
So open consideration of trying to understand what's out there beyond the region I live in, what's happening in the world, I think is a huge learning for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And there's significant dichotomies as well. I mean, somebody in Germany thinking about AI and their personal data being used for AI purposes, has a very different attitude than an American. In America, we have less of an issue with people being concerned about their digital privacy. It is just so. We give away much more information in America voluntarily than you would find the case to be in Germany. And what does that mean in the context then of AI? And it means a lot, because you have, as you see from EU legislation that was passed immediately, you have this sort of defensive knee-jerk reaction, which, I mean, in this particular case is exaggerated and hopefully will not kill the phenomenon itself that it's trying to regulate. because that's the European tendency to regulate and till it dies, and then maybe ask what's different.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are some tough questions which have to be answered.
Yeah, I think governments are struggling with that. Organizations are struggling with that because, as I said earlier, you can't go through LinkedIn, you can't go through any major business publication unless there's something as it relates to that. And this is why we're so glad to have you on. Not only because of that, because you've traversed so many different spectrums that you bring a lot to the table. As it relates to that. From all of your career growth. So as we begin to close out, what closing thoughts would you have for our audience? We have audience all across the globe. Let me just take a minute here to recognize some of our frequent listeners and our guest, Peter Piccinini, who's always, every time we log in, it says, great way to start the weekend. It's a Friday morning staple for Peter, and I appreciate him. He was also on the course, and he started in theater, and now he's in wealth management. And this is what makes it so unique. John Self, who's a very dear friend, started as a journalist, and now he's in careers, executive search, and all of those kinds of high-end things. Jim Moy, who's also a dear friend out of Washington, D.C., lived next to me, my neighbor in Saudi Arabia, always been in law, but I'm saying the diverse audience that we have. What would you like to say as your closing thoughts as being a guest on the CEO series?
You're very representative and of what you've just mentioned there. This efficacy in the workplace through diversity. You mentioned the clients that you have, and you mentioned earlier when we were talking, also these individuals who took on a path that was seemingly different from what they had been doing before and going to various ranges. And I would say from a CEO point of view, never give up on the thought of diversity, especially when you are in international expansion mode. Your talent from that point of view is going to be more than just the raw material that drives your business. It's going to be the nuts and the bolts. It's going to be everything. Mm-hmm. And if you are thinking cross-border, global, then needless to state that you also have to reflect that in your workforce composition. It sounds like obvious to say, and it is, but if you look under more careful inspection, it's not something that all the companies that we talk to actually practice run. We see the very, very opposite many times.
I know. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yes. But this is from my own background. I would give as the main takeaway here.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for being a guest. It's been a long time since we had a coffee chat at Bergman Mall in Dubai, but we must do that again. And for any of the listeners, you're looking for a terrific speaker who brings a lot to the table as it relates to artificial intelligence, a higher level discussion of artificial intelligence. This is the person that you want to reach out to. I listed all of his links in all of our social posts. And going forward, if you're looking for a speaker, this is the person for you to engage with. So with that, we're going to close it out. But all the listeners, I want you to hang on a minute because we have a closing thoughts from my side on growing our base. So Severin, just hang on for a second as we close out. Okay. The CEO series is more than a conversation. It is a masterclass in leadership. Each episode pulls back the curtains on the real journeys behind success, the pivots, the setbacks, the reinventions. But let's face it, a career is never a straight line. It is a collection of defining moments, hard choices, and quiet resilience. If you find value in these stories and our episodes, help us grow this community. Like the post, share it with someone navigating their own journeys, but follow us to keep learning from the leaders who have walked the walk. Let's continue to inspire, grow, and shape the next generation of bold thinkers, one story at a time, every Friday. If it's Friday, it is the CEO series. Thank you so much for listening.
Take the CEO series with you anywhere, anytime. All episodes are now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and major streaming platforms. It's not just an interview, it's a masterclass in leadership.